Relegated. Book 2, Burden of Destiny. Written by Jensen. Narrated by Jensen. The thing that hath been, it is that which shall be, and that which is done is that which shall be done, and there is no new thing under the sun. Ecclesiastes 1:9. Introduction. Row 82 silently watched the others gather some supplies as he refueled the large van. Only a few days before, he had been hunting them down for having the audacity to use ancient relics called divine keys to break the fundamental law of his upbringing, survival of the fittest. For Row 82, life had always been about finding ways to improve oneself through technology and strategy. When he had discovered a hidden medical facility for his first Augment Superior Omicron 77, he earned himself a set of surgical procedures that put specialized plates behind his ears and implants in his brain and throat that elevated him into the sensor echelon of augments. Most of his colleagues were relegated to struggle with simple hand tool or head mount augmentations, and while they believed they would prove themselves fit for survival, Row 82 knew that being a sensor type increased his survival skills much more. Omicron 77 had valued the sensor skills that he had installed on Row 82. He had been a small augment with a number of ranged weapons and armored plates installed in his body. He also had augmented vehicle parts onto himself so that he could travel quickly. The hit-and-run tactics that he and his group of augments had relied on had been quite successful. Perhaps it was because of his success that Omicron 77 believed he could quickly surprise Row 82 and cannibalize him for his augmentations. Of course, Row 82 prided himself on his awareness, and he had seen the designs of his master well before the attempt came. Row 82 fled and planted explosives behind him. Omicron 77 pursued after Row 82, and just as the sensor had predicted, he was blown into bits. In the rain of flesh and machine that Row 82 watched, he obtained a conviction that he was fit for survival, and the determination to prove it to the world. Because of his confidence, Row 82 had felt so frustrated when Lucas Flynn, who was only about 10 years old, had bested him in tactics. It was not long before he realized that they were in possession of divine keys. At first, this had seemed trivial to him. After all, believing in the power of ancient artifacts seemed only to be superstitious. He had been surprised when Zeta 28 had contracted with him to obtain another of these divine keybearers, Kirana Sepharvaim. He had found Zeta 28's devotion to the ideal survival of the fittest to be refreshing. He had been able to perceive the strength of her regenerative augmentations, as well as the defensive plating on her vitals, and had concluded she was practically immortal. Unlike other augments, though, she was determined to become even more fit by finding ways to improve her strength, speed, and intelligence through cruel experimentation. When he had learned that the divine keybearers had triumphed over her in the form of young Jonathan Knight and his soul key, he had lost respect for Zeta 28. In desperation, he took a job from some fire demon worshippers to retrieve one of these divine keybearers. The idea of working for these superstitious types was frustrating, but proving himself stronger than the largest of them made the task agreeable. He had captured the muscular 7-foot-tall Sig West using his perception and skills, and delivered him to the fire demon worshippers in the Ice Palace, content that there would be at least one fewer divine keybearer of which he would hear. He had been even more delighted to capture Daniel Young, the healer of the group, and Jennifer Cedar, who was a beautiful woman who had time-traveled from the distant past. With great satisfaction, he sold these people to Kappa 16 for a large sum of credits. Confident that he had proven himself superior, he was prepared to leave. Instead, he discovered that the other divine keybearers had escaped and spared the lives of the demon worshippers they had defeated. It seemed as though they were trying to directly disprove his survival of the fittest faith as they headed toward Kappa 16's plantation to free the slaves. He became determined that they would have to be stopped, and formed a contract with Kappa 16 to do so. To his shock, even Kappa 16 had believed in the power of these divine keys and expelled him from the plantation after he had killed Stephanie Mason's mother, Natalie. Of course, having already been paid handsomely for Daniel Young and Jennifer Cedar, he could afford to hire a group of like-minded augments himself. It had not been surprising that Lucas had set several traps for them as they pursued. He had helped his team avoid damage from these traps and push through. It had not been surprising to find the divine key-bearers fighting a demon lord, Felix Light, deep in the caves of the Rocky Mountains. It had not been surprising that his highly trained team was able to gain the advantage. What had been surprising was when Lucas Flynn had given him the divine key of perception, and it had chosen him to be its keeper. After Lizard had obtained the space key and Felix had been defeated, they had decided to travel back in time. For the first time, survival had not meant being superior to others, it meant being chosen. Of course, his willingness to divorce himself of his old philosophies had diminished when he learned the true intentions of the group's healer, Daniel Young. Still, in spite of the setbacks, he could not deny that the divine key-bearers, including himself, had survived, even when it seemed they were not fit to have done so. Row 82 was determined to understand the limits of the divine key's powers, and he had agreed to go with the others. It was not long before they were ready to head down the mountain toward the destroyer. Though they had not enjoyed adequate sleep, they seemed energized by the desire to get back at the man who betrayed them. Dr. Daniel Young, who had seemed to value the preservation of life above all else, revealed himself to be a monster both figuratively and literally. By sacrificing thousands of lives, he became the very creature that they had gone back in time to stop. The gentle healer had become the destroyer. The eccentric old man had become Abaddon. At last, Row 82 hopped into the driver's seat, and after everyone was in, he began driving back toward the healing shrine at Jennifer's direction. "That's where Drew Baker is headed," said Jennifer. "He will not make it." Her voice cracked slightly as she remembered the sacrifice of the heavenly shield-bearer to save her. The road that wound down the mountain had been sliced, presumably by the same dark beams that Abaddon had used in the mountain cave. It was clear that his power had greatly increased as he had killed the helpless victims of the sleeping sickness, as large sections of earth had slid down the slopes after being cut, forming large heaps of dirt, rock, and timber at the bottom. Even through the vibrations of the van moving down the road, they could feel the ground shake as their enemy cut its path down the steep grade. It was not long before they noticed smoke rising from a group of trees. The dark fires that surrounded the destroyer had ignited the dry pines that were scattered across the face of the mountain. The tips of the flames could be seen glowing yellow and orange in the low light as they continued their descent. The scent of smoke grew more intense with every turn. Abaddon had probably not been slowed by the need to use the graded switchbacks that eased the descent of the van down the mountain, so it was impossible to know when they might run into him. Everyone seemed more alert as they looked out the windows and moved closer toward the destroyer's path of destruction. Kirana tried to remain focused on what was happening outside the car, but the proximity between Stephanie and Jonathan made her uncomfortable. She looked down at the mirrored key hanging about her neck. She remembered Erica's words, that it was a difficult burden to wield the Heaven's Sword key. She glanced toward the others. No one else seemed to have any difficulty using their keys. Even Victor had picked up Heaven's Breath, the divine key of healing that had been discarded by Daniel Young, and used it as though it were meant for him all along. He had described his experience before picking it up as though he were called by the key. She had felt no such calling at any time with Heaven's Sword. She took a deep breath and tried to clear her mind, but she felt alone. Other than Lucas's word, she had nothing to really indicate that she was the Heaven's Sword bearer, and she began to wonder if he had been wrong. In the meantime, Victor's curiosity regarding Jennifer's origins had increased. He looked at her long blonde hair as she rested her head on his shoulder. He wanted to be careful with his choice of words, and he glanced around hoping for some inspiration or something to help him summon the courage to talk to the beautiful Time Key Guardian. Jennifer noticed his discomfort. "What's wrong?" she whispered. "Oh, nothing is wrong," said Victor. "If that were true, you wouldn't be shifting around so much," countered Jennifer. She sat up and looked into his eyes. "In truth, I am worried about something, but it's something dumb," confessed Victor. "What is it?" asked Jennifer with genuine concern. "I don't want to make you feel uncomfortable," said Victor slowly. Jennifer's eyes grew wide with worry. Though the two of them cared for one another, they each thought their feelings were one-sided. Hearing his statement made her frantically search her thoughts as to what his statement might be a prelude. Had she done something wrong? Was he sick of her? During the pause, she internally considered the possibility that she was overreacting, and he might have had his arm fall asleep from the position in which she had been sitting with him. "I am really curious if you remember where you are from," said Victor at last. Her mind raced with analytical thoughts. Did he think she was weird or too old for him? Was he curious about her time? Or did his question represent an intent to learn more about her? After a few moments, she took a deep breath and spoke her mind. "Why do you ask?" said Jennifer. Victor lowered his head as if ashamed he had asked the question to begin with. Jennifer struggled to interpret what he might be thinking. "My parents always talked about the Golden Age as the pillar of civilization," said Victor. His voice was low, but Jennifer could tell he was sincere. "They said that people had sacrificed much to make the world great. I never even thought about the people that came before that, until Erica said that you were one of them." Jennifer trembled slightly as she thought about the words, "one of them." She turned away, feeling out of place. "I wonder if you remember anything about the ancient times," said Victor. Jennifer felt awful. She was no more than a historical artifact to satisfy the curiosity of others. She lowered her head, feeling as though she had been rejected. She felt unvalued. Victor recognized her discomfort and finally spoke up. "I mean," said Victor as he clarified, "I imagine that it had to be amazing and beautiful since it's where you came from." Victor regretted his word choice as soon as the words left his lips. He lowered his head and looked away, hoping to avoid a judgmental look from Jennifer in response to his cheesy choice of words. It had sounded more flattering in his head. The silence seemed to last for a long time before he turned to face Jennifer. To his surprise, she was beaming. The corners of his lips turned up in a subtle smile. Jennifer cleared her throat, realizing that Victor had asked her a question. "I only really have flashes," admitted Jennifer. "Just a feeling that I was trying to find something, and that I was worried I might be late." "I'm sure your memories will come back in time," said Victor reassuringly. "After all, you regained many of your memories of this time." "That's true," said Jennifer. She turned and looked at Victor. There was an awkward pause. "If you have a question, you can ask me," prompted Victor. "Erica Kingsley," said Jennifer. "She wanted to know who you were and where you came from." "Yeah," said Victor as he remembered her reaction. "She never cared about anyone but Peter," said Jennifer, "but it was as though she had seen you before." "You think even key-bearers in this age saw me in their visions?" asked Victor. "That must be it," said Jennifer. "But," she paused, "I want to know where you come from, too. You remember your family, right?" Victor paused for a moment. "I really did just grow up in a small compound," said Victor. "My parents were farmers. We grew tomatoes and corn, and we had a small herd of goats that we used for milk and meat." "You were an only child?" asked Jennifer. "Well, I wasn't the only child in the compound, but I didn't have any brothers or sisters," said Victor. "I remember that my mother and father had very similar personalities. For the most part, they were focused on work because they believed it was important." "But not always?" guessed Jennifer. "No," said Victor. "At night there were stories about the divine keys and a golden age when there were spacious cities and delicious food. They told me about the guardians and their amazing abilities to teleport across long distances, to read the minds of enemies, to slice through their enemies' defenses, raise shields to protect the innocent, and miraculously heal grievous wounds. Some of the other children in the compound said that the divine keys were made up, and being a foolish child, I believed my friends over my parents." "But you remembered what they said, at least," observed Jennifer. Victor nodded. "Their voices sounded different when they spoke of it," said Victor. "It was not the same way they spoke when they were farming or when they asked me to do something. They spoke as though they remembered it." Victor turned to face Jennifer. "That sounds foolish, doesn't it?" said Victor. "That's impossible, of course." "I have a difficult time knowing what is possible," said Jennifer reassuringly. Victor smiled. "As I grew older, my parents taught me to use weapons," continued Victor. "The others in our compound believed that we were secluded enough that it was more important to focus on farming, and when the attack came, they ran and hid in their huts, hoping that my parents could save them." "But there were too many augments," whispered Jennifer. Victor nodded. "The augments that they could not stop rushed into the nearby huts and slaughtered the others," said Victor. "There was no mercy for women or children, for the sick or the elderly." His voice grew lower as he remembered. "They withdrew to me and told me how to leave." Victor choked slightly as he remembered the smoke pouring out of huts all around the compound. "They made me promise to find the divine keys. I was so angry with them for thinking of a stupid legend when everyone around us was being killed, but they wouldn't let it go until I promised I would look for them." Jennifer did not know what to say. The description of slaughter made her feel awful, and she felt sympathy as he described his frustration with his parents' instructions. She took his hand instinctively, trying to comfort him as he recalled being separated from his parents. "After I did, they protected me as I escaped," said Victor. "Even though they cut down dozens of augments, they gradually began to take injuries from the invaders. Swords, knives, axes. Finally, my mother and father took the pins out of several grenades and held each other closely." "They gave their lives to help you escape," said Jennifer. Victor nodded. "I've never told that to anyone else," said Victor slowly. "I'm glad you told me," said Jennifer softly as she looked into Victor's eyes. "They may have paid a high price, but you're obviously important." "You mean because I keep showing up in people's visions?" asked Victor. That was not what she meant. She meant to tell him that he was important to her. She meant to tell him that she cared about him and wanted to be with him. As she opened her mouth to confess her feelings for Victor, the van suddenly lurched forward. Her head slammed against the seat in front of them, and she lost consciousness. Stephanie, Lucas, and Lizard were also thrown forward and incapacitated as the vehicle rolled. Victor gripped the handle on the roof of the vehicle and looked out the window as the van finally came to a halt. The unmistakable dark glow of the destroyer appeared in front of the vehicle. To Victor's surprise, Abaddon did not seem as interested in the van as he did with a motorcycle roaring toward him. The rider fired a machine gun at the destroyer, causing the dark fire surrounding Abaddon to swirl about him defensively. As the motorcycle passed by, Victor caught a glimpse of the rider, and his eyes widened with surprise. It was the woman that had seemingly abandoned the council and its goals in exchange for peace and quiet. Erica Kingsley was fighting the destroyer single-handedly.